We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Brooklyn Lischtishin, and today for our very first video podcast episode, we are joined by Terri Cardinal. Terri Cardinal is MacEwan University's Associate Vice President, Indigenous Initiatives and Engagement. Terri has been a pivotal force at MacEwan since joining the university in 2017. Terri's impactful work includes creating safe space for Indigenous students and supporting community connections, fostering greater Indigenous representation, and inspiring future generations. Terri is from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, a mother and also co-creator and co-host of her podcast, Two Crees in a Pod. Well, thank you for being with us today. You are our first video guest in the studio, so that's also very exciting. Can you start by telling us kind of a little bit about your podcast, because you also have one?
Yeah, no, for sure. So thank you first for inviting me to be on the podcast. So I also do a podcast called Two Crees in a Pod, which was birthed from COVID with my good friend Amber Dion, who is works in the School of Social Work here at the MacEwan University. And so she called me one night and asked... and it literally was like 11 o'clock at night, and we had been in lockdown for about 2 weeks. And she said, I have this idea. And I said, what's your idea? She's like, that we start a podcast. I don't know what that looks like, but this is the name. And she shared the name, Two Crees in a Pod. And I was like, I love the name. And so we didn't know what the heck we were doing at that time. And so I took a course, a brief masterclass on podcasting. And we started our podcast in May of 2020. So we've been doing it over 4 years. It's really amazing podcast because it really grew from just the idea of how we bring forward Indigenous voices to a platform that is easily accessible, specifically to our students that we teach, as well as to our communities. During COVID, obviously, everybody was in isolation, so we wanted to ensure, like, how do we stay connected? How do we stay connected to our own communities and to our students, and also really bring forward the knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, conversations from scholars. And so initially, the podcast was to build, to really go through the COVID, but we're out of COVID and we're still recording. So we're going into season 7 this fall.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I guess it's been a couple years now.
It's been over 4 years. Yeah, it's crazy.
It seems like yesterday. You're talking about kind of embracing traditional practices and educating people. We talked a little bit before about your experience with traditional end-of-life practices. Can you explain to us a little bit what that is?
Yeah, and so maybe I'll just go back a bit, because I think that, like, how did I come to do my research on traditional end-of-life practices? Was in my master's program, I was focusing a lot on ceremony as healing practices. And so I'm a student at the University of Calgary. And I remember in those classrooms in my master's program asking questions that my professors didn't have an answer to. And so really supported me in going back to my community and working with our elders and our knowledge keepers and building those knowledges to support what I wanted to learn about. And really, I wanted to learn about, specifically my community. I wanted to learn about and understand trauma. I wanted to understand historical context, specifically to Cree people. And so when I got into my PhD and was really looking at research, ceremony and healing was quite broad. I really needed to focus on a stage of life. And I moved to the end of life traditional practices at end of life. And that was personal for me. And so when I made the switch, I had multiple losses in my life at that time. And so one of them was during this time, actually, it's an anniversary coming up on Thursday, August 29th, was late Roxanne Tutusis, who was a knowledge keeper here at MacEwan, was actually our first Indigenous knowledge keeper facilitator. And she passed during COVID. And she was also working on her master's at that time, and she was working on prenatal death practices, like traditional perinatal death practices. And so it's interesting because I think that like my own experiences experiencing losses, and then I lost a friend, a colleague, a student here at MacEwan to cancer as well during that period of time within the 6 months. And, you know, I had time to have conversations with her about this. And so, you know, I've also had some really traumatic experiences with death, you know, losing a loved one to suicide when I was younger. And so I think that part of this research, and in an Indigenous research, and why I feel that many of us who do research are really doing research to also identify with our own healing journey in some capacity, but also witnessing and experiencing how traditional practices have impacted and changed the way we heal and have changed the way that we grieve and mourn our loved ones, and how encompassing our practices, our ceremonies have to ensure that we move through the loss of a loved one, and in a way that's going to help us move through the process. Because I think there's been a disruption. We know that colonization, there's been a disruption with colonization. And so we have to bring back, I feel like I have a responsibility as, you know, a daughter to my parents to bring back and look at the resurgence of our Cree teachings, our Cree laws, our Cree ceremonies, and ensure that my own daughters and that, you know, my future grandchildren know who they are first, and as being, you know, Cree people. And so the end of life research that I have been embarking on has been in some ways difficult because there's not a lot of literature, Western literature out there in relation to the questions that I'm asking. And so again, oftentimes that goes back to going to our elders in our communities and asking those questions to those who hold the knowledge, you know, and those are our elders. And so I find that with the current literature, it's not there. And a lot of it is very heavily influenced with Western practices. The other thing too that I've been diving into is just understanding the Western literature on end of life, and more so specifically the science of it, whether the science of the brain when we have experienced a loss. And it's been interesting because I've been able to, in my Cree brain, I should say, in my Cree brain, you know, when I read something about science in a Western of understanding in a way, automatically I think our grandmothers did that. You know, our grandfathers do that, or we do that in ceremony, or we do that, you know, it's a lot of that is already based in things that we do within our culture. And so our ceremonies, our practices, our teachings aren't for nothing. There's reason and science behind it. You know, as our grandmothers were scientists, our grandfathers, you know, we have the knowledge really embedded in our communities.
That's very interesting. I also kind of experienced lots of loss as well as suicide in my life. And it's very difficult to find any kind of like practice that is caring and fostering to such a traumatic loss. And especially now, I think you're kind of just assumed to go back to work or go back to school without really kind of having someone explain or even kind of talk about what is the next kind of like process. I guess there's like Catholic in different ways, but I was reading about Indigenous teachings about how when someone passes, it's the beginning of a journey.
Right.
Yeah. So what kind of like is an example of an end of life practice that you see in your communities?
Well, and I'll go back to that what you're saying in terms of, you know, the understanding that it is an end of life. And so in my research, because I'm in a Western institution, I use end of life terminology because it is what people know, right? So it's like when I say end of life, you know what I mean when I mean end of life, right? Or if I talk about death. In our language, we don't have a word for that. And so the word is usually translating to the spirit that is leaving a physical world here and moving into the spiritual realm. And so it's a moving on to the next stage of life. And so we don't necessarily see it as an end of life, so to speak, but really a movement into another, as in birth. Like end of life and birth are very much connected, is when we're coming from spiritual world into physical world, right? And so there is this process and this circular process of how we experience that. And so when I think about a, end of life, traditional end of life practices, I'll share a story. And this is just helpful for folks to understand a bit better. And I always want to ensure that when I'm speaking, that I'm speaking from my own experiences. And so I mentioned that I had lost a friend to cancer. And so we had some time with her, and such a beautiful human being. And so she was very comfortable talking about death.
Yeah.
She was very comfortable in ensuring that when it was her time to come, that we were following in alignment with traditional practices. And because, again, we have a mix within our communities, you know, and that's totally fine too. I think we see more of our people leaning more towards traditional practices. And so, for instance, she was very clear in direction of like the process of her funeral, right? She wanted to ensure that there was ceremony involved in her funeral. She wanted to ensure that that we were, her loved ones were taking care of her after she passed, her body prior to the funeral. That there was multiple ceremonies that happened prior and after. And so there was a list of instructions essentially that she shared with us. And so I got to experience that throughout her end of life. You know, I think about the last 4 days of her life, and I was with her along with her loved ones, her mom, and it felt like ceremony. And so we have our 4-day ceremonies in the summer, and it felt like that. You know, it was the point in her life where she stopped eating, she stopped drinking. She grew still. She wasn't talking. I felt like she was in just a space of like prayer almost. And so it was really interesting to experience that. And then when she passed, you know, I was one of the ladies invited and really honored to be invited into the space to prepare her. You know, we got to dress her, and I got to do her makeup, you know, and she had her sister-in-law do her hair, and, you know, and there was instructions of like more of the traditional aspects that happened in that room as well with her. And that was so beautiful. And I'll be honest, you know, before that I had a lot of anxiety going in there. And I think that once I got in there and there was laughter and there was tears and there was joy and there was love, that something switched for me. And it didn't feel as heavy. and then to go into the funeral process, the traditional burial processes, and the teachings around why we do what we do, was really important. And, again, like just to be able to hear and feel and see love at end of life or at that transition period was really beautiful.
How do you think that now working at MacEwan, you can use these experiences to teach students at the school or other faculty?
My background, I've been studying under social work, more predominantly Indigenous social work practices in my work. And so, when I think about where do I pull from in the work? Where is the space that I pull from in the work that I do? What leads my work? And it really is focused on my connection back to my family and my community and who I am as first, again, a Cree person. So really ensuring that I am grounded and foundational in my culture, my ceremonies, tradition, language, and ensuring that those always come first. And so when I think about any decision that I'm making, and for, with students or with others here at the university, it's like, how is this going to benefit Indigenous students? How are we ensuring that we're removing barriers and really bringing forward best practices as an institution as a whole? And so I think first and foremost, it's really about, I encourage students who move into post-secondary is to don't lose that. Don't lose who you are, because I think sometimes I had a lesson when I started at MacEwan in oh my God, I'm going to age myself. I graduated in 1999, but I attended MacEwan, I think it was in 2001. And or 2000, and I tried to blend in. I didn't necessarily I felt like I had to hide who I was. I wasn't necessarily always proud of who I was because in the classrooms they were teaching about my people in a very deficit-based manner, and so I would sit in the back and I would be quiet, and that taught me something. And I hope that when we have Indigenous, and I see it like I do, I'm lucky that I get to see that now, is we have Indigenous students coming in, and they're embracing and they're wearing their ribbon skirts and they're engaging and wanting to engage in culture and ceremony. I didn't have that opportunity when I came here. And so, really about embracing who you are. And that is foundational in success for students. If you can be strong and confident in your own background, you'll be successful in everything else. You can learn the curriculum, you can learn the stuff that you need to in your degree, but that richness of identity is so important.
Do you think, what are some ways do you think we could kind of foster that community and kind of help engage students to get involved?
So kihêw waciston at MacEwan is a student support center, but we really also support faculty and public. And that we engage and really want to foster community. And so we think about, not just our team being able to support students, but also how do we all collectively come together and support one another in the work that we are doing. And so community is brought into our spaces. Faculty, when we think about and I really encourage faculty, we have a number of educational sessions that we run throughout the year, and we always try to engage faculty into our spaces so that they feel comfortable, for instance, teaching. Maybe there is a topic within their course that focuses on, Indigenous history, and they may feel uncomfortable with some aspect of it. We have resources in places at the university that we can provide one of our staff members, one of our elders, knowledge keepers to come into the classroom and provide that support. As well as we connect very much with many different elders in the community. So we're not doing everything on campus. Right? So we have elders who have been doing ceremonies and offering opportunities for ceremonies and events and other cultural events outside of MacEwan where students can attend and go. And we get asked, often, like, when is the next, thing happening? And so there is oftentimes many opportunities that we create for folks. And I think that one of the big things that I'll stress is that it's about really laying out the opportunities on campus and ensuring that, people have a choice if they choose to engage in that or not. The last thing we want to do is make things mandatory for folks. We don't want to force people to engage in those things if they don't choose to, but really building this community of support. Oftentimes we have students coming from way up north. Right. So they're moving to a city with no family, no supports in place. And we encourage them to connect with our staff and with students in the kihêw waciston Centre so that they could build, again, those supports of community.
Oh, that must feel nice.
Yeah, it does. I think that, based on my experience, and I never thought being here as I guess I would have been 18 at the time when I started at MacEwan, never would I have thought that I would be here as an AVP. It's 20 years or whatever years. We're not going to say that later. But I think that there was a reason why I experienced that way. And I think that to be here and to be able, and I think a lot about my kids, my daughters. And I think about what is their experience going to be like? What is their experience going to be like when they go into university and college? I want them to really grow into a space and be able to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And that's part of my role too, is like, how are we ensuring that we're building on Indigenous curriculum in the institution? Because, my babies have, the right to learn about themselves in places like this too.
Yep. The universe always shows you what to do.
Oh, I know. For sure.
Okay. Well, we have one final question for you. And it is, what advice do you have to any listeners, faculty, or students, or any advice at all?
Man, that's a great question, and I think that there's lots of things that I could list off, and really try to think about what is, whether that is to students or whether that is to faculty or the community as a whole. One of the things that actually I'll touch on, and it's come up in my realm of work in the last year, has been, and again, it may be a little bit off topic from my research, but it's been around identity fraud. And because I've talked about identity, I've talked about research, I've talked about, who I am as an Indigenous person, is that I really encourage folks to explore in post-secondary and when they're thinking about research around their identity. Because it's the cool thing to be Indigenous right now, there's people who are faking to be Indigenous right now for research dollars, for scholarship dollars, for
music awards.
For music awards. Lots of, and I sometimes I'm like, for what? I question. There's also this. Alongside that is that, along with being cool to be Indigenous right now, and I say that in a joking way, but it is the idea that there is cultural exploitation as well happening. Again, my research has been focused a lot on my own lived experiences. I grew up on the res. I'm proud that I grew up on the res. That was a privilege for me because I have some cool stories from that too, And so I think that it's come to a point where it's harmful where we have people coming into the institution and they are claiming Indigenous ancestry, making Indigenous claims to benefit themselves, to benefit, again, like whether that is for money, whether that is for scholarship, lots of different things. And I think that we're hosting an event on September 26th at MacEwan, in person and online as well. It will be recorded. So the recording will be available publicly. And the event is called Truth First, focusing on identity fraud and cultural exploitation. And so we have amazing international speakers joining us, and really just to, have a conversation to educate folks about, like, and if you don't know, you don't know. And so when you bring this to the table and I could say, hey, think about when you're hiring the next time and you have somebody claiming indigeneity, how are you going to verify that? Or how do you know that they're actually Indigenous? Are you ensuring that there's proper questions being asked in an interview process or an application, right? And so I think that it's just like, how do we have best practice to ensure? Because what we're seeing is that there is the actual Indigenous people are being pushed out in spaces that shouldn't be. And so I encourage our listeners to join the event, get educated on that. And that's important to research, because you're seeing a lot of that specifically in research, because there's dollars attached to that. And so with that, I appreciate, it's a different vibe to be, interviewed. Usually I'm the interviewer. And so I appreciate being invited on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, and thanks for sharing your stories. We appreciate, and we'll have you back anytime you want.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thank you. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit us at Research Recasted on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We post new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can give us a follow, leave a like, or send us a message from any follow-up question you have for today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, a knowledge mobilization podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University. Thank you for listening and watching.